We have the last presentation of WCC PCI 2014 that features Additional Professor of Cardiology from All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Dr. S. Ramakrishnan. This afternoon, Dr. Ramakrishnan joins us for the next 12 minutes to deliberate on pulmonary hypertension, following which we will take questions by the chairpersons and the audience.
So I hope I'm the 11th man to come to the crease. So hope I don't get a zero. So my topic is interesting cases, a collection of cases that we have seen over years, all of them with some form of pulmonary hypertension. This is the first case, like it's a 57-year-old male. He came to me with class 3 dyspnea of 3 months duration. There was JVP elevation with hepatomegaly with features of congestive heart failure. The TR velocity on the referral was around 58, the normal RV function. And a CT angiogram was done outside and suggested a dilated pulmonary artery. And some other suggested tests have been done, and all these tests were negative. And there is no evidence on HRCT also to suggest there is anything abnormal in the pulmonary artery. There is no history suggestive of COPD or anything was there. So he was started on a diuretic, a regime of diuretic, digoxin, sildenafil, and a pantoprazole. So he was not doing well. So the improvement was less than satisfactory. So there was a question like whether to increase the sildenafil dose or switch over to tadalafil or add bosentan, or whether you should replace sildenafil with bosentan. All these things were there. Then I thought, let me see the echo. So on the echo table, he was doing this. In the afternoon, he was just sitting there and wait. I finished an echo, and before I come back, he was just sitting. He was not an obese patient, so he was just sleeping. He was dozing off in the echo. Then suddenly something struck me, and I got the polysomnography, and he turned out to be a case of obstructive sleep apnea. And after 3 months of CPAP, TR velocity is 26, and he's off all drugs now, no pulmonary vasculitis, and he's doing pretty well. So this is one-off case. Even though it is always in the chart, somehow it goes off our mind. So these are the various alternative diagnoses that have been done in a specialty clinic. Like ILD, most of us are always looking for an ILD, and ILD generally is prominent. And PAH, patients presenting to you as PAH and then later on turning to be ILD, even though it happens. But in today's era with HRCT and everything, it is generally picked up. Pulmonary thromboembolism, the pickup rate is improved. And structural heart disease, so we are expected to make a diagnosis on echocardiogram. And obstructive sleep apnea, this is a Western data, but even we are beginning to see patients in our practice. Since awareness is improved and therapies are available, we should be actively looking for obstructive sleep apnea because that can be life-changing for the patient. Otherwise, the patient would have been added on a bosentan or an ambrisentan, cath would have been done, and lot of unnecessary investigations would have been done. But mostly, we should always rule out obstructive sleep apnea, and we should move away from the think that only obese patients have obstructive sleep apnea. We should not have that concept. So this is the other case. She's a 19-year-old female. She's a medical student. She had insidious onset of dyspnea of 3 months duration. Echo showed RA and RV were dilated with a TR velocity of 75. The CT angiogram clearly showed a chronic thromboembolic PH. So even though with the advent of CT angiogram, it's more and more well recognized now in India also, it is thought it is less common in Asians because factor V laden mutations are less common. But recent evidences suggest that venous thromboembolism and pulmonary thromboembolic diseases are not so uncommon. That is only because we were not diagnosing them properly. But still, I feel even though the pickup rate has increased, still the rates are far below than optimal. Like we are missing a lot of pulmonary thromboembolism. So what should be done for her? Should we add ambrisentan, bosentan? Should we subject her to surgery, or should we put her on tadalafil? This is one form of pulmonary hypertension which is potentially curable. So she undergoes surgery, and she is actually cured now. Her TR velocity is again in the range of 30. Functionally, she was class 3 earlier. Now, post-surgery, after endarterectomy, she's absolutely class 1 now. So she's just on oral anticoagulation, and she is doing perfectly fine. We should all remember that chronic pulmonary thromboembolism, surgery should be done. If your surgeons refuse, send the patient to a center which is capable of operating on a CTEPH. So in today's time, it is said that at least 2 experienced surgeons should say no, that the anatomy is not suitable for a pulmonary endarterectomy before the patient could be put on a PAH-specific therapy. So we all should remember that PAH-specific therapy has a limited role. It's far inferior to surgery because it's potentially curable. So this was a 14-year-old boy. This is my third case. It's a 14-year-old male with a PAH with a TR velocity which was slightly larger, around 70 was the TR velocity, but LALB were slightly volume overloaded. He had a 6-minute walk distance of 480 and a saturation on rest was 90%. So this was the contrast echo. So you can see LLV was slightly volume overloaded, but there was a PH. And there was no intracardiac shunt. But then this glitched the diagnosis. You can see in the contrast echo, there is a negative flow and it's a large PDA. It's a large PDA that is actually still shunting left to right, but producing a lot of pH. So contrast study is invaluable. So these are some of the things, obstructive sleep apnea, especially when it is not a 20-year-old female that you are seeing with an idiopathic PH, always think of obstructive sleep apnea. Contrast echo is invaluable in ruling out. Why? What is the importance? Like, why, if I labeled this person as idiopathic pulmonary hypertension and not as PDA with Eisenmenger or PDA with PH, what is the importance? Importance is the prognosis is hugely different. A person with PDA PH is likely to live for up till 45 years at least. Especially in a guy with 20-year-old with saturation of 90 is likely to have a reasonably good acute atrial survival compared to a patient with idiopathic PH. So these two investigations are invaluable. They are CT angiogram and a contrast echocardiogram in our setting. Especially in India, most of the patients are not diagnosed. We are operating at up to around 20% of children who need a congenital cardiac surgery at the right time. So most commonly missed are a PDA Eisenmenger and a AP window and Eisenmenger. These are commonly missed as idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. So another important thing that I would suggest is not all PDA Eisenmenger will have a differential diagnosis. So that's not absolutely mandatory. In even the classic Paul Wood series also, only 50% was the incidence of differential diagnosis in PDA with Eisenmenger. So these are the various therapies that are available in now, and a lot of improvement has happened. This is a 40-year-old male with a known case of Eisenmenger. He presented to us with hemoptysis. So earlier we used to do give him Linctus codeine and give him a prescription of antibiotic and pray to God that it doesn't recur again. But what we have started to do now is do a CT angiogram during the procedure of a hemoptysis, during an episode of hemoptysis. And this is to our surprise, we are finding a lot of aortopulmonary collaterals. A lot of large aortopulmonary collaterals are being found in patients with Eisenmenger syndrome. So this is a large prospective registry of study that we have been doing now. So out of the 95 Eisenmengers who have come in this time, 38 had presented with hemoptysis and 57 did not have hemoptysis. Out of the 38, all of them underwent a CT pulmonary angiogram within 2 weeks of hemoptysis. And out of the 38, we could find a cause. Most of the causes were aortopulmonary collaterals, and others included a rupture and a pseudoaneurysm in the pulmonary artery. 2 had pulmonary thromboembolisms, and interestingly, 2 patients had pulmonary tuberculosis, which we actually initially, even retrospectively, when we looked at it also, we felt that it is part of the increased pulmonary blood flow, but it was miliary pulmonary tuberculosis. So these are the various causes that we found. But some of you might ask, what if, like, okay, there is collateral, you have coil embolized, how do you prove that this was what is causing the hemoptysis? So we followed them up. In patients who had a hemoptysis, we found who had a cause, and where we are able to correct the cause, the recurrence rate was far lower than patients whom we did not find a cause. So potentially establishing that these were critically essential, the cause of hemoptysis. So because most of our patients are not operated in time, operability testing always is one of the most common problems. So I have taken 2 esoteric cases just to emphasize that this science is not totally evolved, or we don't understand it as fully as we think. So an 8-year-old boy presented with exertional dyspnea for 4 years. Hemodynamic and angiographic data are shown. These were the data. The PVRI was 26, the PA pressure of 108, with a mean pressure of 90, with a step up of only 4. But most importantly, he had large VSD Along with that, his wedge pressure was elevated. He had associated mitral stenosis. So even if the PVRI is reclusively very high, which precludes a surgery in conventional wisdom, but we thought it is severe MS that is contributing to both precapillary as well as postcapillary hypertension. So we decided to go ahead and operate upon this kid, and the kid is doing well now. This is the postoperative PA pressures. After 6 months of surgery, the PA pressure is 54/18 with a mean pressure of 40 with a PVRI of 8 Woods units. So maybe long-term results are known, but most likely the patient will likely to do well. This is another very interesting case which really perplexed us, and we don't know what is the reason, what is the understanding behind this case. So 11-year-old male with transposition with VSD PAH. He was catheterized at 2 years of age, and this was the data. The PVRI was 17.9 with a step up, huge step up there because it's all TGA, we expected a step up, but aortic saturation was only 65. So he was advised a palliative sending. So this is at 2 years of life. But then typically what happens, he lost to follow up. He comes back after 7-8 years and he makes a new file and comes to us, and we thought we will catheterize again. Then at that time he says, I have already been catheterized at 2 years of age. Then we find out the data, and then we again still felt that we should catheterize him again. So we catheterized at 11 years of age. At this point of time, the step up is there. The aortic saturation is 66 and the PVRI is 6.6 only now. So we don't know why such a thing happened. Maybe at that time the lung vascularity was low, the lung vascularity has improved, the lung compliance has become better now, and the child undergoes a switch and a double patch VSD closure. Now this is after surgery, this is after 3 months. Now the PVRI is 2.5 with a PA pressure of 38, the mean pressure of 23. So these two cases highlight that we always, since it's not a Western problem, so there are no randomized control data that is available. Most of the time we will be basing all these decisions on our experience and taking a complete collective data of the patient. So whatever said and done, this operability testing remains an inexact science. So I will finish with 3 quick cases. So this was one patient who presented with PH and with an absent right pulmonary artery. So is the patient operable or inoperable? The FA saturation was 85 with a PA pressure of 95. But we thought, since one of the lung is tight narrowing the RPA and it's almost absent RPA now, the next lung, the LPA is totally facing the systemic circulation, the pressure is here, given here. We thought, once you connect them in parallel, the resistance is going to be 1 by R will be equal to 1 by R1 plus 1 by R2. So we thought we can connect them and still go ahead with the surgery. And this was the pre-surgery CT angiographic reconstruction. So this was actually a small portion was completely atretic, it was absent. So then this was the surgery, post-surgery. So we put a graft in between the RPA, and the post pressures are around 60 with a FA saturation of 92%, and the patient has symptomatically improved. So some of these things do happen, like the absent RPA, and very rarely we find patients with absent pulmonary veins. You can clearly make out the pulmonary veins on the left side are absent, and this is the angio of the patient. You can see the pulmonary artery is filling slowly, but no pulmonary venous filling can be seen. So this patient will last within few months of diagnosis, but this you can see the intense pulmonary venous hypertension. And pulmonary veno-occlusive disease, this is one reported from our center. So this was a histologically proven. The most important thing about all these diagnoses is these are not esoteric things. Most of these patients come to us with a label of idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. The most important thing that we can do to them is not to start them on pulmonary vasculitis, because all these pulmonary venous absent or pulmonary veno-occlusive disease will do worse if you start them on pulmonary vasodilator therapy. And they are very costly. So at least they are anyway going to die, let them die without spending that money which is going to harm them. So this is one rare case of pulmonary capillary hemangiomatosis that we have been published from our center. So this is the last case that tells you clinical auscultation should not go away. This was a 12-year-old who was referred to us with idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. He was started on sildenafil and he was not doing well. He was referred to us. And we did only one thing, that is auscultated on the axilla. There was a huge murmur. There's a big murmur. We auscultated on the axilla not because we tend to auscultate at that time everybody, but we thought the pulmonary artery on echo was not that dilated for the amount of pH that is seen. Then this was the angiogram of this patient. So this was a bilateral diffuse pulmonary peripheral PS. Since most of the time we won't be able to see such peripheral pulmonary arteries, so we often tend to miss them, but it can be easily diagnosed or suspected once you put a stethoscope in the axilla or put a stethoscope on the back. So now from this case, we have started to pick up clinically and gives immense joy once you pick up one case with a peripheral PS and you make a diagnosis of peripheral PS and get a CT angio done and it turns out to be peripheral PS, you are extremely happy. So peripheral PS brings us to Takayasu arteritis, which is quite common in our part of the country. So we should always rule out Takayasu arteritis in the presence of peripheral PS. And rarely, even though this disease has become pretty rare now, but EMF is also a known case of pulmonary hypertension. So this will be the last case. So of late, we have started to recognize, maybe we have around 5 cases of Abernethy syndrome in our center, which is extrahepatic portosystemic connections as a cause of pulmonary hypertension or as a cause of pulmonary AV fistulae, especially the diffuse forms of pulmonary AV fistula. So most of these patients, when they undergo a CT angiogram, we should include the liver cuts also, and we should be actively chasing them because some of these forms, depending on the type, could be just interventionally managed and the pH could disappear in them. So these are the various tests that have been proposed. So they are not just for the sake of the things they are there. They should be actively sought because one test and one intelligent pick can change the life of a pulmonary hypertension patient. And we have, to be very fair, we have seen almost all the different categories of pulmonary hypertension in our center, but most of them, when they are referred to us, come to us with the diagnosis of idiopathic pulmonary hypertension. Thank you very much for kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ramakrishnan. We'll have the next 5 minutes for discussion on the papers. It's over to the chairman. Thank you.
Such cases so often. So one clarification from Saurabh that suppose sometimes we get now because our eyes and ears have opened after your presentation that we get a case of a mild cyanosis with a normal echocardiogram. Then suppose we want, then we as a normal habit because we are doing from the left side, the vein is on the right side and suppose we give a right contrast, that is normal. Then should we give the left arm contrast? Or and then follow it with the IVC to LA? Suppose you want to see abnormal, what should be the sequence of a contrast echo?
Generally, recommended sequence, normally in echocardiogram it is the left side which is being used. Because most of the time if you are having a left SVC to LA, that is a commoner cause of cyanosis. More so if it is draining to the CS and there is partial unroofing or complete unroofing of the coronary sinus. Other abnormalities are quite rare. But if your clinical suspicion is high, I think it is important to do the contrast angiogram from the right side first. IVC to LA is much rarer and probably less than 4 or 5 cases would be reported in the world literature. Total anomalous systemic venous connection again is a very extremely rare condition. Fortunately, I saw a case just a week back. I could not show the recordings because of some technical glitches. But in those cases, you have to do the contrast from both upper limb and lower limb to be sure that we are actually draining into the left atrium. Of course, the CT angiogram is the modality of choice, which can show these things very well. But it is invasive. It involves a lot of radiation, which is not good for a child. So I think bubble contrast is the... Yes. Usually it is recommended to do from the left arm.
So interestingly, we have seen 2 cases of post-operative ASDs. They have become mild cyanosis later on. So one case was like it was the IVC was actually routed to the LA because there's a problem in the septum. There's a large eustachian valve that was connected to the septum, and that was one case that we have seen. So you have to be clear that there has to be a reason for mild cyanosis also.
The question is to you, Dr. I have to look at Ramakrishnan. It was a very nice talk, but I was wondering why you, all your patients, you did not think of atrial septostomy. None of them you had atrial septostomy done, while it can relieve it will increase the cyanosis, but it will relieve the pulmonary hypertension because it's published recently for the past 4 or 5 years, several publications on this issue.
No, like this presentation was like to show the different causes of pulmonary hypertension, not exactly focusing on the management sequence of pulmonary hypertension. And we in India, we have done quite a number of balloon atrial septostomy for PH. Because in India, we don't have the availability of prostanoids, we don't have prostanoids here. So we generally, after sildenafil and bosentan, if the patient is suitable for a balloon-atrial septostomy, we do balloon-atrial septostomy. And we have also now, of late, have started to do something called the port shunt. So port shunt has also been done in a few cases like.
What is the
Port shunt.
portion?
Yeah. It's a left pulmonary artery to descending aorta shunt, surgically done. So that also is very helpful when in the
This is Fox shunt.
port shunt.
Port shunt, okay.
Improve the pulmonary artery flow, because in the PAH, if it is extremely advanced, there is no flow occurring to the pulmonary arteries. So you have to send some blood to the lungs to get it oxygenated. So if it is not happening otherwise, you connect it to a higher flow situation like aorta. If you can create a surgical port shunt, there are some literature available which says that interventionally also it can be achieved if the pulmonary arteries
Yeah,
are
but they
large.
were not mentioned, so that's
So
why I was wondering.
I think he focused on different types of PH where we can miss actually.
Okay.
So
I just have a comment that all the echocardiogram and all cardiologists dealing with children should be a pediatric cardiologist. For the misinterpretations and rare diagnosis, all the cases should be done by a cardiologist specialized in congenital and structural heart disease. I think this is the message. So my message too in the morning that the neonates and is not a young child and the child is not a young adult. They should be treated by specialists. My second question is about your case, this RPA2 left atrium, which is very rare. We have a case like this and we closed it with an Amplatzer device. So what did you do about your case?
to LA?
This, you will show the case was RPA2
Yeah,
left
yeah.
atrium.
We have, as Dr. Ramakrishnan must be well aware of those cases. Actually, we have some 3 or 4 cases, out of which 2 are interventionally closed. This has been published in CAT-CVI, JACC intervention 2 years back. We used the Amplatzer device to close
Also-
it, and we went transeptally to close it.
Okay. Mhm.
Good cases. Thanks for presenting those cases. My question to Dr. Ramakrishnan is, are there any programs, a dedicated program for pulmonary hypertension in most of the cities, or is it kind of whoever comes in contact treats them? Is there a multidisciplinary program for treatment of pulmonary hypertension?
Unfortunately, no. So only Hyderabad has started to have some work groups, and that's also not like ideal PH clinics that you have in the West. So it's still only a very few people are interested in pulmonary hypertension in India, and they keep on doing the work. And dedicated clinics are in the process of being started. Right now, there is no PH clinic as it's in the West is common practice. The PH is managed by a PH specialist. The reason is mainly like it's a vast country, there are not many people who are interested in PH, and secondly, only major centers have these facilities for all these things.
Well,
There are
even-
few interested people are there now. Things may be better off maybe in 2 years' time.
Even in US, most of the centers doesn't have the dedicated programs, but except for large tertiary centers. And we have seen the outcome of patients treated in a comprehensive center is much better than the centers where there is no comprehensive program.
Absolutely, that's agreed.
Any other questions from the audience? I have
Okay.
2 questions brief to both of them, Dr. Saurav and Dr. Ramakrishnan. Are there any centers in India which are doing lung transplant?
Yeah. The adult transplant has really picked up now. So there are many centers now, at least 5 active centers are there who are actually doing transplants, and but it's in the numbers are in like not in 3 figures now. So no center has crossed 3 figures as yet. So it's like for a country like India, it's like minuscule. Like the transplant program is like literally it has started, but it has not kicked off.
And the second question, yeah, Saurav.
Regarding these 2 conditions, I think what somebody mentioned from the audience, it's very important that nothing can be taken for granted, that it's going to be normal. Nothing is idiopathic. We have to go and investigate them further. I think that is the message from these 2 presentations which we should take, and the rest of the things will fall in place. Once we know the amount of burden we are dealing with, we'll have things to treat and all other things will happen. But once we are ignorant about it, we are not going to move forward.
What is the cost of Bosentan in India?
What is the cost of? Cost of? Bosentan. So like roughly it translates to Bosentan and ambrisentan, because ambrisentan is a OD dose and Bosentan is a BD dose. So cost turns out to be like 3,000 for the starting dose and 5,000 per month for the double the dose, like 3,000, 3,500 for the 62.5 mg BD Bosentan and 5 mg OD of ambrisentan.
Okay, if the questions are done, we'd like to thank the chairpersons and both our invited speakers, Drs. Gupta and Ramakrishnan. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of the academic deliberations of 9th World Congress on Clinical Preventive Cardiology and Imaging. We'll have some words from Dr. Chopra before we move on with the closing ceremony. Dr. Chopra, please.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, sir. But it's a very prestigious and very important session. This was just a pre-conference CSI or rehearsal of clinical vignettes. And I could see the enthusiasm and zeal in both Saurabh and Ramakrishnan. Is going to be a hit program in the CSI. In the CSI, they're going to have this program in two halls simultaneously for 1 hour each on both the days. And I think it was very educative, the way both the speakers have participated. Let's give them a big hand. With these few words, ladies and gentlemen, we are at the end of our WCC PCI 2014 conference. This is the 9th conference which has ended today. And we make a very humble announcement. The next 2 conferences we have already planned. The 2015 will be in the Golden Temple. I do not know myself at the moment what is the availability of the accommodation there, but I'm sure the guy who is going to be the organizing secretary, Dr. G.S. Wander. G.S. Wander is a professor in Ludhiana Medical College and Hospital. He's also going to be the API president, so I'm sure he will do a good job. He's assured me he will do whatever best possible. And then the subsequent conference will be in Puttaparthi. I met Dr. Chaudhary yesterday and I announced, he has assured me that the conference 2016 will also be of a great standard. In 2017, Satish just spoke to me half an hour back, we'll have it here, right in the Mount Abu. So we have planned for the 3 conferences right here.